and I want to welcome everyone. There's so many of you on the webinar right now, and I really, really appreciate that. It kind of feels like, you know, you watch like those 6 games of the French Open leading up to the final, and a lot of people show up, and then Nadal plays at the end and everybody shows up. So Jonathan, that's you. And so there's no pressure here whatsoever. I'm grateful to President Holloway for being here. I'm grateful for our team at the School of Public Health that has led this amazing webinar series over the course of the last year, really having some frank discussions about how racism intersects with health, with public health, with clinical health, and undermines the well-being of people and populations. And we're going to put a ribbon on all of it today with President Holloway leading us out of this webinar series. So thanks to all of you who attended. You know, at the School of Public Health, we take these issues really seriously. We know that anti-racism efforts are not just about checking boxes and words, but about actions and beliefs. And so over the course of the last year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, we've all worked collectively to really have some frank conversations within our school, but also to develop tools that really get us to reflect on what we're doing in our curriculum for our students to prepare the next generation of public health researchers, scholars, practitioners who are going to do the work out there. You know, it comes naturally for us, as you all know, because we believe that health issues are not just biological, they're not just psychological, they're not just social and structural, but they're all of those things together. And so when we see the COVID pandemic ravage marginalized populations, communities of color, immigrant populations, it's no surprise to us because we know that minority stressors are the biggest drivers of chronic and infectious disease in our country. So it's also great to do this work in a university where we have a leader, where we have a president who actually understands these ideas in his heart and in his mind. And so let me do my formal introduction of President Holloway. President Holloway will be presenting today on mapping value, structural racism, and health consequences. Dr. Holloway was appointed the 21st president of Rutgers in 2020. He's an eminent historian specializing in post-emancipation United States history with a focus on social and intellectual history. Dr. Holloway is the author of several books, most recently, The Cause of Freedom, A Concise History of African Americans, which was published last year. Prior to accepting the presidency at Rutgers, Dr. Holloway was provost at Northwestern University from 2017 to 2020, and a member of the Yale University faculty from 1999 to 2017. At Yale, he served as Dean of Yale College and the Edmund S. Morgan Professor of African American Studies, History, and American Studies. Dr. Holloway earned his bachelor's degree with honors in American Studies from Stanford University and a PhD in history from Yale University. Dr. Holloway serves on several boards, including the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, and he's a fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations. And I am honored and I am appreciative of Dr. Holloway's leadership and taking the time today to have this conversation with us. Please all welcome President Jonathan Holloway.
Thank you so much, Perry, and thanks to everyone for being part of this series. You know, I feel, Perry, you said we're wrapping this up with a ribbon. I mean, that, no pressure, right? I mean, my God, lots of pressure, and especially when I consider the topic that I'm speaking on. I'll give a few words to help you understand the genesis of this project, but I want to emphasize very clearly, I am a generalist right now, speaking to specialists. And so I know I'm at a great disadvantage that if you are here after the first 10 minutes, it's mainly because you're being polite, because I will not be breaking new ground with you for a while. And then it's a two-part talk. And the second part of the talk is the part that I think will get more into my area of expertise. It's sort of the table setting part. And then the more, the meal itself. Is this the way I look at it? So a bit of what this project is part of a larger conversation, at least I'm having in my own head. There's a book project, as a historian, it's all about books. And so we are notorious as historians to putting the book that we're working on and on the CV. And it's really notorious when you're administrator because the opportunity you have to actually work on the book is slim to none. But I am chipping away at it ever so slowly. And this book project is called The History of Absence, Race in the Making of the Modern World. And it's envisioned as a very short book. And it's always asking in standalone essays, it is looking at a phenomenon of how is the world, in this case, the United States, made via conversations, or frankly, the lack thereof, relating to race. To be more specific, I've written a chapter on museums and a chapter on universities. And in each of those chapters, I'm asking the question, what happens when what is a historically white space, when it starts to recognize the Blackness that is in that space? And it's always a moment of disruption, and when a lot of things start to bubble to the surface. And I'm not going to go into what I talk about in museums or in universities, but and then there's a third chapter that is actually looking at found material, in a sense, a headstone, a coin, and a passport, and how these mundane objects tell stories about that are about race without ever talking about race, that tell us about what we value. And that's where we get to this talk, where all of these things, these chapters are really asking about invisible things to which we attach value. And so in this talk, it is really about, it's about maps. So what do we call this talk? I already forgot. I've lost my title page. Oh, mapping value. That's right. So it is a two-part talk that explores the role that maps have played historically and more to our present day. And one of the value propositions coming out of map making is one of the needs is to have an important conversation about the health consequences of our society, the way it's been structured. So this is very much a work in progress. Again, a generalist speaking to specialists. And with all those caveats aside, or in place, not aside, very much in place, let me jump into the talk. First, some introductory comments, and then you'll see where I'm going. This pandemic of ours has revealed many unsettling truths about this country. To cite but three, our public health system is fragile. We lack sufficiently robust and sophisticated communication strategies that can relay fact-based knowledge in a highly fluid and politicized environment. And radical inequalities in the social safety network run along gender, race, and class lines. For those of us who work in areas of inquiry that are based in, say, histories of racial inequality, these comments are not so much revelations as they are facts on the ground. However, the physical and psychological disruptions of the pandemic have made it difficult for large swaths of the population to remain in denial about these truths. So, given that these truths are not new, what do I feel the need to set the disclaimer about this being? Why do I feel the need to set the disclaimer about this being a work in progress? Part of my challenge is that my day job makes it difficult for me to stay on top of the literatures in a way that will be required if these thoughts move towards publication. Those who have content knowledge about, for example, the CDC and its work on the social indices of health, in other words, all of you, will know that I'm offering summaries more than brand new analyses. With time and hopefully with your suggestions, I'll move toward where I need to be. More substantively, though, this talk is also work in progress because as much as people are becoming newly familiar with how to talk about health outcomes as they are related to gender, race, and class, there's something quite uncertain about our current moment. The means of collecting, interpreting, and deploying knowledge are changing with such a lightning pace that I worry that we are not prepared for the consequences. I'll linger on this point and why I think it matters in the final section of my presentation. So, part one, old maps, value, and facts. We live in an age of existential threat and spectral death. Silent killers in our current moment, embodied as microorganisms, float around, perhaps infecting us through contact, perhaps through the air, their constant mutations confounding a lay public that lacks the epidemiological knowledge that would otherwise help it make sense of each new phase of a virus's journey. We wear our masks, or we don't. We are confused to the point where we end up doubting the utility of vaccinations that will keep us alive, despite hysteria's proclamations. This is a hysteria fueled by some sort of phantom belief that that which we cannot see should not be a threat. The invisible is the political. This is a distraction, but it is also the truth, though not in a way that fearmongers would have us believe. The hysteria we are navigating these days is a manifestation of anger or frustration about existential threats that limit our ability to enjoy what we have been trained to believe is our birthright, namely freedom. Yes, in fact, the invisible is the political, but it's the things that we cannot see, or more particularly, that we willfully refuse to see, that are the actual threats. The pathogen, certainly. The ideology, absolutely. The value system at its core. In December 1860, the 8th Census of the United States was completed. While the decennial United States Census really should just be about counting people, assessing property, etc., it has always been a politically fraught undertaking. Whole narratives, essentially political and cultural Rorschach tests, emerge that tell us about the state of the American mind when we start to study these tallies of the country. When it comes to the 1860 census, we find narratives of a country in which slavery was a legal part of the national economy. And because enslaved people literally had value, their presence was counted carefully. If one can abstract this just to a matter of counting and accounting, sorry, I forgot to share my screen. Pardon me one moment. We will be in shared mode for the whole talk. You'll see a lot of black screens. That is, if you imagine me walking around a stage, just imagine this in person. The black screen is there on purpose. Nothing is wrong with your screen. So just that little caveat there. So going back a sentence or two, when it comes to the 1860 census, we find narratives of a country in which slavery was a legal part of the national economy. And because enslaved people literally had value, their presence was counted carefully. If one can abstract this just to a matter of counting and accounting, this map is simply about the geographic distribution of a labor force per county and state. Do a quick check. You can see this okay, by the way? If I can get an affirmation.
Yes.
Thank you. Beautiful. All right. So this map, if you think of it as just a matter of counting and accounting, this map is simply about the geographic distribution of a labor force per county and state. What we see here are the manifestations of agricultural patterns of mid-century America. The census taker would find enslaved people where tobacco, cotton, and rice were the main products. This region is most famously known as the Black Belt. If you can follow my mouse from South Carolina, North Carolina, South Carolina, top of Florida, over to the Mississippi Delta to East Texas. This area is most famously known as the Black Belt. You'll also see high densities of enslaved people heading north in the middle of the map. Mississippi Delta heading up the river here. I'm circling it in an oblong fashion. The darkest counties here, the dark counties here, the darkest on the map, in fact, align perfectly with the Mississippi River. The density of enslaved people increases as one heads south toward the Mississippi Delta, with shaded counties on both sides of the Mississippi, indications of where the alluvial plains supported often physically punishing agricultural industries. This is all very straightforward. I just received an alert. Am I still here? I got signed out.
Yep, you're all good.
Okay, I don't know what was happening there. The world of our Zoom life. So this is all very straightforward. But there are two more stories to be told. The first is found in a detail at the very top of the map. There we go. This artifact was created from the data the data census takers were able to accumulate for a specific purpose, that is to raise funds for sick and wounded soldiers of the US Army. In other words, this map, one that tells a story where physically subjugated people lived and labored, was designed to be a moneymaker, a tchotchke. It is an artifact then with a doubled utility. It maps value, and it was created to be of value. Someone thought this map would be an effective means of raising money. But was it a map to remind people of the heroic work of a liberating army? Or was it something more akin to what we now call a heat map, an indication of risk and value? I'm not sure, but I do know that these musings affirm the importance of a close reading as well as context. In the case of context, I want to take the data that this map provides and project the information forward roughly 150 years. This leads to a second story. Black screen on purpose. We know that this map tells us about where value, in this case enslaved people, lived. What the map makers in 1860 did not know is that their map would tell us something damning about today. There is little arguing that slavery cast a long shadow on life opportunities for those whose labor was forcibly extracted and for their descendants. There's also little arguing that life opportunities for Hispanic Latino populations have also been radically compromised due to a slew of socio-political actions over the centuries. The consequence of constrained opportunities, where one can live, the quality of public schools, access to healthy food, access to quality healthcare. The consequence of constrained opportunities is real and is captured in data that tells a discouraging story about social and health inequities. The following slides capture data taken from a variety of sources: the Census, the National Center for Health Statistics, the National Center for Education Statistics, US Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Kaiser Family Foundation, so on. I'm not going to linger on every line here. It's the composite that matters the most. So here we have a snapshot of life in 2014. And I'm going to just read through some things very quickly. Again, it's the total sense that'll be important. And this is stuff you all know. A snapshot of life in 2014, poverty, 10% white, Hispanic, Latino. These are the way these are categorized here. 23.6% Black, non-Hispanic, 26%. Incarceration for male inmates per 100,000. For whites, it's 610. For Latino, 836. For Blacks, 3,611. Infant mortality per 1,000 live births, 5.1 for whites, Latinos 5, for Blacks 10.8. Life expectancy, 79 years for whites, 81.8 for Latinos, Latinx population, for Blacks 75.6. Diabetes-related mortality, age-adjusted, for whites 19.3, for Latinos 25.1, for Blacks 37.3. And mortality related to heart disease, age-adjusted mortality per 100,000 people, 165.9 for whites, 116 for Hispanic Latinos, and 206.3 for Blacks. Now, something to keep in mind, and I'm sure you're already thinking this because of your expertise, is that this is data taken before the pandemic. All of these indices have gone in the wrong directions for these populations. The inequities, I don't have the data in front of you, but you've seen this, you've generated the information about the mortality rates for African Americans and Latinx populations have leapt up, I think, at a greater pace than ever in the wake of COVID and the way it's just ravaged these particular communities. So what I just told you was the good story, which is the harrowing fact of what COVID has meant. So taken together, this data tells us about the health consequences of the radical disinvestment or underinvestment in certain regions of the country. But we need to push it a bit further. The data I've just conveyed is abstracted by a line reading of compiled information. I read this line, I read that line, so on and so forth. It's just a series of concerning numbers. But a mapped visualization exercise helps us see the connective tissue that binds this data to the 1860 census map of enslaved populations. And here I'm pulling from 538.com, the mortality rates. This is about cardiovascular. There's a whole series of different maps I could have shown you that 538 generated. And if this works properly, this is the cross your fingers moment. Okay, this is 35 years of American death. If you can see here, you can click on all these other options, essentially. We're focusing on cardiovascular disease. And we're gonna watch it evolve over 3 decades. So we started in 1980, and this is where we are as of 2014. I'll play it one more time. Now, even though incidences of cardiovascular disease have been going down since 1980, the highest distribution of cases still occurs in the former Confederate States of America. This is also where the highest concentration of African Americans still live. A map from the US Census Bureau that covers 2015 to 2019. Oops. Haha. There we go. And this is the beginning of that map. And this is the end of that map. This is in case the animation didn't work. Lost my place here. A map from the US Census Bureau that covers 2015 to 2019 right up to the pandemic, affirms the persistence of African-American demographic density in the former Black Belt. So if we go back to, so I'm going to go back and forth quickly. If my mouse appears, you can see density along the eastern seaboard coming up to Mississippi Delta and up the Mississippi River. This is in 1980. It's not as bad in 2014, but it still maps. It still is darker here and then definitely darker up the Mississippi River. Well, where do Black folks live? This is literally where Black folks live. So if we go back to the 538.com animation, we see a very high correlation between African-American residential patterns, as well as low income, poor health indices, and a shorter lifespan. When I shared the list of health indices a few minutes ago, I also referenced Hispanic Latino members as defined by the sort of data, lines of data I gave you. The same observations about high correlation between residential patterns, income, and negative health indices holds true for Latinos as well as for Native American indigenous populations. These two 2015-2019 maps from the Census Bureau call our attention again to these connections. So this is a story, I've been telling the story of African-American population density and health outcomes. The exact same story can be told about demographic density, health outcomes for Hispanic Latino share of the population, and then this one for American Indian indigenous populations, Native American indigenous populations. It's the same story. So these phenomena help transition us to another map that speaks to the interconnections of the cultural ideologies that undergird structural racism and then to the health consequences of this phenomenon. This map is of Union County, New Jersey, very close to where we all work and live. Some of us may be in the county. The map is a byproduct of the Federal Housing Authority established in 1934 as part of the New Deal. The FHA, Federal Housing Authority, created a nationwide, oh, by the way, this is from the Mapping and Equality website. It's an astonishment, check it out. The FHA created a nationwide system of maps that rated neighborhoods according to the perceived stability. As one would expect, green is good, red is bad. Those properties outlined in green received A grades, letter A grades, and were smart investments. Those properties outlined in red, so-called red line neighborhoods, this is where the word comes from, phrase comes from, were high risk and often ineligible for FHA-backed mortgages. Redlining, a practice that wasn't outlawed until 1968, exacted a heavy toll on marginalized communities. The legacies of redlining practices are now fairly familiar territory. Generational wealth disparities, poor educational opportunities, food deserts, and limited access to quality healthcare. But when we go back to the map and go down one layer, we discover the cultural practices that supported the creation of this type of map. Excuse me. Here we see a sample survey. Don't bother trying to read this. I'm going to walk you through it. Here we see a sample surveyor's document for the borough of Roselle, New Jersey, located in Union County. It's a routine affair, cataloging the pace of growth in the area, the types of buildings, sales trends, and so on. However, when we go to look in the open text box down here, the description and characteristics of the area, we find the cultural apparatus of the 1930s and 40s that was, in fact, a valuation of people. This level area, well, you can read the whole thing. The main thing I want you to see is that later on in this document, you see my mouse right here is where I'm going to start to read. The first part is fairly generic descriptions of what it is. Otherwise, this is a typical Negro area of poorly maintained, unattractive properties. Yards, both front and back, are usually in disorder, and even the streets are often littered with trash. There are piles of junk and old metal in a number of yards, and here and there are shacks and nondescript houses. The tendency for this Negro population to spread out is adversely affecting surrounding neighborhoods, and as a result, mortgage money is difficult to obtain anywhere in this area. It pains me to point out that this language is actually quite mild when compared to other appraisals in which words such as infiltration are used to describe Black residential patterns. If you can bear with me 1 second. This is the Mapping and Equality website. And I always have to go back and remember. Okay. Huh. So this is, this is the, I'm going to skin this cat a different way. I'm going to do that all over again. Something went haywire there. All right, here we go. There we are. Okay, here we are. So this is the same map I just showed you, and you can click on different areas on the map and you can pull up the data. I'm just sort of sharing the process. I think this is the one. Yes. So you can click on the map. It can show you the scan. This was the same kind of document that I shared with you. Go back to the map here. But you can see in this descriptions and characteristics of area, many streets in the latter section have substantial clean-looking houses, but market prices were depreciated several years ago because of the rapid infiltration of the less desirable types of residents. There are now Negroes on Raymond Avenue, and Italians are scattered on either side of these concentrations. And it just continues in this way, and the population down here, shifting or infiltration, Italian and colored. The apparatus, the cultural and political ideological apparatus that we call structural racism are alive and well, given to us by the surveyors doing, what they would have thought is just assessing value in properties, not thinking that they're assessing people the whole time. Now, I provided a list of redlining legacies a moment ago. I'll add one more item to the list right now. I was talking about poor schools and I talked about cardiac issues, certainly. I want to talk about one more, and that's asthma. African-American children suffer from asthma at rates almost twice that of white children. Historian Richard Rothstein points out, and this is in, I forgot the book title, sorry. It's at home right now too. Richard Rothstein points out that this is almost certainly due to the fact that most Black children live, quote, in or near residential industrial neighborhoods with more dust, pollutants, and vermin. The consequences compile. Children who suffer from asthma will have more difficulty sleeping, will come to school tired and unable to focus, will miss more school, and will have less opportunity to thrive academically. It is the opposite of a virtuous circle. In March of 2022, basically almost exactly a month, almost 2 months ago, excuse me, New York Times reporters Raymond Zhang and Nadia Popovich published the article, How Dangerous Air Reflects Racist Policy from 8 decades ago. Zhang and Popovich wrote about redlining policies from the 1930s, the resulting highway construction and industrial developments in the succeeding decades, and the impact on poor Black and brown neighborhoods. They continued, with less green space and more paved surfaces to absorb and radiate heat, historically redlined neighborhoods are 5 degrees hotter in summer on average than other areas. A 2019 study of 8 California cities found that residents of redlined neighborhoods were twice as likely to visit emergency rooms for asthma. Now, while this article focused primarily on Western cities, it turns out the location didn't matter. Originally, researchers anticipated the need to adjust for regional differences when plotting asthmatic responses to residential patterns. Joshua Apt, a professor at UC Berkeley, who worked on the study that was at the heart of the New York Times article, put it plainly. The history of racist planning is so deeply ingrained in American cities, basically of any stripe, anywhere. We went looking for this regional story, and it's not there. To his point, although the Times article focused on the California Bay Area, it ends by quoting Leticia Gutierrez, the Government Relations and Community Outreach Director of Airlines Houston. When Gutierrez takes her children to a park, she leaves her East Side neighborhood, and she says, it just feels like every time that you want to have a picnic or want to be outside, especially on a beautiful day, it just doesn't smell right. And you go to the West Side and you're like, okay, I can breathe here. Taken together, these documents, from the 1860 census map of slavery's demographic density to a map of population patterns and mortgage risk, demonstrate how structural racism becomes intertwined with value assessments that in turn beget negative social and public health outcomes. To put a humanistic turn on the phenomenon, these are maps of broken hearts, literally, and congested lungs. Part 2. That's all the stuff you know. Now let's make it a little unsettling and very local for me. Part 2, New maps. First part was old maps. Part two is new maps, value and speculations. The first piece of advice any new university president receives from their more experienced peers is find ways to extend your honeymoon period. My presidency began on July 1st, 2020. My first day in my actual office was July 6th. It was a moment of high excitement, the first day of school for the new kid, as it were. It was also the occasion of my first presidential press conference. And it was during that press conference that my honeymoon period began to recede. The message that marked its ebbing, the opening sentences tell you what you need to know. Dear Rutgers students, faculty, and staff, I'm writing today to inform you that after careful consideration of all possible models for safely and effectively delivering instruction during the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, Rutgers is planning for a fall 2020 semester that will combine a majority of remotely delivered courses with a limited number of in-person classes. You know this, you received this email. For me, making the decision to go remote wasn't difficult. All of the public health indices and the science behind them made it clear that the best way to protect Rutgers' 100,000 person community would be to move to a largely remote mode of education. Being remote would also give our healthcare providers and emergency responders, those who never got a day off during the pandemic and who regularly risked their lives to protect others, going remote would give them the best chance at managing the deployment of their resources. If the university had remained in person, we would have facilitated the spread of the virus throughout New Jersey and could have overwhelmed the state's healthcare facilities. Going remote was obviously the right thing to do. It is important to remember the realities of summer 2020, putting this in further context. A relentless global pandemic, no vaccines in hand to mitigate the virus's effects, a presidential campaign that seemed designed to foment rage in order to sow social instability, and a racial reckoning that brought millions to the streets to protest what activists claimed were long histories of state-sponsored and extrajudicial violence against minorities. With each month, the levels of anxiety, frustration, and anger only seemed to grow. As far as I could tell, there was no university playbook or even presidential transition reports that could guide me through this thicket. Given the circumstances, when it came to navigating the virus, planning our future recovery, and attending to all the social and political complexities and demands of the moment, the only viable path forward in my presidency required that I rely on science and data, and that I be as direct and transparent as possible in my decision-making. This may sound simple to many, but there are a few obvious moves one can make when it comes to leading a 100,000 person community stretched across a state. As if I needed any confirmation of the situation's delicacy, I would quickly come to learn that some viewed my decision to follow the science and data and to be direct and transparent, all critical to my plans to move the community forward, were deeply political and dishonest acts. On March 21st, 2021, I sent another message to the community in which I said, we are committed to health and safety for all members of our community, and adding COVID-19 vaccination to our student immunization requirements will help provide a safer and more robust college experience for our students. In the weeks leading up to our announcement, mandating vaccinations for students, my cabinet engaged in a series of prolonged and robust conversations about how we could ultimately return to in-person instruction, keep our community safe, and navigate the inevitable legal challenges to mandatory vaccinations. When we announced that Rutgers would require students be immunized against the coronavirus, we weren't aware that we were the first major university to do so. What it meant to be in the vanguard became clear immediately. University general counsels reached out to our attorneys seeking guidance. Local and national media took notice and interviewed anyone at Rutgers they could find. Other public university presidents lamented to me that they wanted to do the same thing, but that their state political leaders made it impossible to move forward in the same way. Despite the obstacles that many public university leaders faced, very quickly, colleges and universities around the country took notice and followed Rutgers' lead. Other factions took notice too. Exactly 2 months after we announced our immunization plan, roughly 500 people gathered on our New Brunswick campus to raise their voices. Anti-vaccination activists led the way in organizing a protest a protest against Rutgers' new policy. A motley crew joined them. Tea Party loyalists, Confederate flag defenders, MAGA enthusiasts, libertarians, and even 3 Republican Party gubernatorial primary election candidates, at least one of whom looked increasingly uncomfortable as the audience's constituency took shape. It was a cauldron of anger fueled by fear and stirred by politics. I was sitting in my office, this office, about a half mile from the rally, beyond hearing distance of the crowd and its speakers. I knew the protest was happening, but I didn't yet know the scale, nor did I know the diversity of the attendees. Then the photograph arrived, and I immediately realized that my twin commitments to follow science and data and to be direct and transparent in my decisions were not going to be received in the way that I had hoped. Before I get to the photograph, a pause to return to the organizing theme of the talk, mapping value. I spent the first half of the talk drawing meaning from two traditional maps or sets of maps across 150 years. The science of map making changed radically in that period. Now, due to the development, refinement, and propagation of new methods of data collection, we find ourselves in a moment when the science of map making is changing again, but at a much faster pace and in totally new ways. And when I invoke the first person plural, I'm being literal. Anyone carrying a smartphone, I safely imagine everyone in this virtual room, for example, is sharing data that goes into making maps. Some dedicated to helping you find your way to a destination with minimal delay, others that become self-generated catalogs, retrospectives of where you've been and what you valued over that tell a story about yourself. In this instance, we have maps, this is from my phone, we have maps generated by my phone that mark the locations of where I've been and where I took photographs. It's this map. You can see I need to get out more often. The 1,000 are from when I was at Yale, the 769 are from when I was with Northwestern, the 799 are at Rutgers, and basically I don't go anywhere else. Tells you a story of my life. But in this instance, we have maps generated by my phone that mark where I've been. It's this map in one photo specifically, and this is me zooming in. The first one is, from the Midwest to the East Coast. Now we're talking the tri-state area. In these series of maps, still now I'm on New Brunswick's campus, zooming in closer and closer. And it's this map, the fourth one I'm about to show you, and one photo specifically that merits further reflection on what we value and the potential health outcomes that are related to this valuation. And now to the photograph itself. So if you look at the left-hand screen, the number 20 in the lower right-hand corner, that's actually a photograph of something on my desk just to the side. And then if you look up at the upper left-hand corner on the left-hand map, near Alexander Library of Brower Commons, which is on the right-hand map. And this is the photograph in particular. So now to the photograph, one that forced me to ask questions of myself and the space I occupy as the head of the community. Now, caveat about this photograph in this map, I did not take the photograph. It was sent to me. I was not at the protest, just to clear up any confusion. I added the geo marker to it manually for the purposes of making the map. So this is absolutely manipulation, like every other map ever made, okay? So here's the photograph itself. While I was unsurprised to see someone proudly wearing a red MAGA hat carrying the Gadsden Tea Party flag, that's a zoom. That's the whole photograph. That's a zoom now. I was unprepared for the poster that equated Rutgers vaccination policy with Nazi science schemes. And while I was disappointed to see the FURU poster, a quote, clever declaration that embodied the creative banality of our era, I could not divert my eyes from the woman wearing a t-shirt that said masks equal slavery. All of these people are in that same original photograph. This t-shirt that said masks equal slavery, a cynical graphic mashup of Black Lives Matter and Silence Equal Death t-shirts. This part of the photograph was the Tripwire. It is here that I discovered the boundaries of my university's reasoned policy approach and our communications plan. Universities are supposed to be places of preservation and discovery. There are precious few other institutions in the country that are charged with the dual missions of preserving the very best ideas expressed across time, while also inviting new generations of curious people to challenge the veracity and value of those ideas. When the institutional culture is healthy and vibrant, a university is a place of tension and cognitive dissonance. But there are limits. If the work of preservation and discovery is to proceed, there must be an understanding that everyone is chasing the truth and that we all have an interest in attaining it. Without the faith that there is something of value, this thing we call the truth, if we don't have a shared faith in that has value, that can guide us to a better place because we understand our world in new and enlightened ways, we're left with a void. And it is this void into which I found myself staring when I looked at this picture. I should make clear, Go back to the main picture. I am no stranger to campus protests of many different types. Taken as a whole, I believe them to be a critical part of the university's ecosystem, as they are as often an articulation of unmet local needs as they are the proving ground for ideas that might transform society. But when I looked at this picture, I encountered a space that was new to me, a space where emotionalism, ahistoricism, and provocative brinkmanship were the things that were most highly valued. This photograph proved the error of my earlier presumption. The protesters' desire to know, to debate, and to inform were being expressed in a symbolic language I did not understand. And if I could not understand their language, how could they understand mine? I can see that the protest was an affirmation of the democratic principles that are at the core of the university's ideals. Further, as much as I found this protest to be antithetical to the university's values, I affirmed the right for the individuals to gather and to speak their piece. But this concession and affirmation do not mean that I'm obliged to sit idly by while ethical scientific discovery was equated with Nazi barbarism. Nor should I be expected to ignore the foolishness in a statement that equates being forced to wear a mask to slavery. However, after discarding the obscene and the ridiculous, where to go? What to do? When I think about maps created in 1860 that provide a visual record of forced labor, I'm reminded of the horrors that undergird the simple tally of where people were held as property. I'm reminded of the whippings, the rapes, the abiding assaults on individuals' bodies, as well as the denial of their humanity. I'm reminded of the holding pens and auction blocks, the forced separation of children from parents, the abbreviated lifespans, the airborne diseases, the profoundly dangerous work conditions, the sweat, the blood, the vomit, the broken bones, the excrement. When I think about these maps and their expression of value, I'm reminded of other documents like this that literally embody value. Here is a sample of script used by the Confederate States of America when it was in revolution against the United States. This $100 bond features South Carolina politician John C. Calhoun in the lower left-hand corner, who was the intellectual architect of secession, a representation of vaunted white womanhood in the lower right, and at the top center, a depiction of labor. In this case, the laborers are enslaved people who, if one is to believe this narrative, are well-fed, well-dressed, and in one case, smiling. That's the gentleman in the back. This was my photograph itself of the script from an archive, and it's quite clear looking at the actual bill, the person is smiling. Here we see what Southern states valued: a politician who was, as I said, the intellectual architect of secession, white women's goddess-like integrity, and a labor system that was docile, cared for, and content. All of these images were intentional projections of liberty, but only for some people. Accepting these images meant that one was committed to looking the other way, to ignoring the narratives of ideological and physical violence that were a daily part of Southern life. To accept this image meant that one had to put on a blindfold, a mask for the eyes, not the mouth, to make sense of one's life. Bringing the conversation closer to the present, when I think about contemporary maps of negative health outcomes and see that they overlay perfectly histories of slavery and other forms of economic degradation, I'm not bemoaning the inconvenience of wearing a mask, and I'm not entertaining the idea that this inconvenience is an affront to that thing we value most in this country, our freedom. I am, I confess, stuck on this protester. I understand the painful histories of super exploitation of Black folks and attuned to the horrors of unauthorized experimentation on Black bodies in the 20th century. And even though the circumstances between, say, the horrific Tuskegee experiments don't align with the COVID vaccination campaigns, I am sympathetic to the sort of anxieties that might emerge from the association of that past to this present. But try as I might, I cannot find a space where I can join this protester because she is willing to do violence to the past in order to make a political claim regarding freedom in the present. This is the crossroads where we find ourselves as we reflect upon the myriad challenges of the pandemic. Social, political, economic, and epidemiological pressures have pushed people beyond a place of reason. We now find ourselves in an era where petty trolling and outrage are outpacing our capacity for grace, patient inquiry, and a search for a better world. Because of science and its abiding pursuit of the truth, we will physically survive this pandemic. But what have we lost in the process? And how will we get it back? I'm concerned about the durability of our democracy in an atmosphere that is damaged so deeply by rhetoric and polemics that are divorced from reality and from integrity and from a shared faith that we can find something redeemable in those we would otherwise consider strangers. As president, it is my job to protect the Rutgers community and to preserve its ability to be of service to the state, the nation, and the world. This is a big task. As a citizen, I look at this photograph and realize that the work is so much bigger than that. And it is work that we have to do together. Thank you.
Wow. See, I was right. Rafael Nadal did show up to play the final of the French Open. Jonathan, that was unbelievable and amazing. And thank you for marrying, which we try to do here at the school also, humanities with health, right? And like living in this intersection where art speaks to science and science speaks to art and it speaks to history, and this encompassed all of it. We're going to open it up for questions. I do want to just share a couple of reflections on your amazing talk, which, you know, some things you don't know about me is like, I actually live here in Newark in a bedroom that's covered in maps. And I have a bedroom that's covered in these old maps of Constantinople and, you know, other parts, you know, old maps showing the various, you know, atrocities human beings have imposed on each other. And one of them, the maps, is one of them Mercator projection. And for those of you who are not aware, that's one of the original maps that showed the world, where Africa was super tiny and Europe was like super big. And it's completely distorted as a means of sort of lifting up the importance of white people in Europe when those maps were made. I do also want to share, as people are thinking about their questions, a couple of other maps for you, Jonathan, to think about, because I think they're really, really interesting. Here, first of all, and I use this all the time in my HIV class, is a map of HIV in New York City. And if you look at the map of HIV on the left, which is in the blue, you see prevalence in various parts of the 5 boroughs, including here in Lower Manhattan and throughout Manhattan. But when you look at the mortality rate, where people are dying from HIV, what do you see? You see it in poor communities, often Black communities. You don't see it in Greenwich Village. You don't see it in the financial district. And this, to me, is an ultimate indication of how social conditions fuel health disparities. One more map I want to share, if that's possible, before I take it to questions, which is this map and relevant to this last week. Here's a map of what the abortion deserts will look like. This is published in The Guardian just in the last 24 hours. And if you look at the map on the left, the current law row intact. On the right, it's showing in dark red where there will be abortion deserts throughout the country if Roe is going to actually be overturned. So we have our work ahead of us to fight these really, really horrific issues that are challenging the health of people and population. So thank you, President Holloway, for your insights. And I'm going to open it up to folks for questions. And I think I'm going to look at this. Oh, are you ready? Are you ready, Jonathan, for some questions?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Cool. So this is a question from Viva White, and Viva asks, what are the ways we can modify the mapping or think about mapping to increase diversity, since we live in very segregated ways here in New Jersey? What can we do to continue to break away the sort of like and now sort of indulging her comment, to break up the sort of segregated neighborhoods?
So listen to what I'm saying the whole way through, because it's going to sound really messed up at first. Segregation is not the problem. It's all the infrastructure that goes along with the segregation. I'm not advocating segregation, let me be clear. But like the only thing that I think I've ever agreed with in Clarence Thomas, ever, is he would, and he used the argument in a different way than I would use it. There was some case I've long since forgotten, the case was dealing with basically segregation in public education. And he very correctly pointed out that there was an era for African Americans of excellent public schools, and they were segregated, taught by Black teachers. And this was separated by class lines within Black America. So poor Blacks still got crappy situations. I'm not romanticizing this, but there was a very vibrant Black public education network that runs along the East Coast down to the Southeast, and generated kept generating Black leaders 20, 30 years down the line. Brown v. Board, which I wholly support, just to make clear, just to make this unambiguous, destroyed Black schools because it disemployed Black teachers, because you couldn't have the thinking was you couldn't have Black teachers teaching white kids. When the architects for Brown v. Board, who brought the case, NAACP, Legal Defense and Education Fund, when they did not go after segregation, they played this very smart game. They said, look, we'll abide by Plessy v. Ferguson. Separation of the races is declared legal and constitutional in 1896. We'll do that, that's fine, but they aren't equal. We'll have our Black schools if you fund it in the same way you fund a white school. Now, they knew that was never going to happen. And so the logic of supporting segregated schools on Plessy v. Ferguson fell apart. They knew that. So for me, I'm not trying to be coy when I say segregation is not the problem. The way we live it in this country, of course, is the problem. But we need to start thinking about, where do we fund things? How do we fund things? We could have the most amazing, quote, inner city schools in the country if we paid teachers better, if we built better schools, if we made sure they had access to high-speed internet, if we made sure that there weren't rats running around the hallways. It's not the location that matters. It's all the infrastructure, the cultural infrastructure underneath of it that results in a broken system. So for me, getting to your question it goes really deep in trying to understand that, because it's about unpacking an economic, a social, a cultural apparatus that we call America, frankly. There's a reason it works so well, because there's a logic to it that appeals to the people who have power for the longest time, and they're hanging on to it for dear life. So how do we generate new maps? We can think of it in a couple of different ways. Redlining as a practice was declared illegal in '68. The practice still survives. If we can find a way to actually break the effect of the practice still survives, if we can find a way to change the funding mechanism for mortgages that were equitable and reasonable and not predatory, as we saw that led to the financial collapse in 2008, then you can start a conversation. If you want to actually disrupt in a good way these maps, then you pour money and accountability into our public school systems. You got to do both. You can't have one without the other. And that would be disruptive to lots of people politically on different places in the spectrum, but you got to have both. If you want to disrupt these maps, it means you got to provide healthy food, like everywhere, not just in Whole Foods and not just at prices that I can afford, but the folks who are going to the local public high school cannot afford. So if you want to disrupt this map, you need to make sure that there are, at least as a starting point, free and accessible health clinics for all manner of need that are catered to specific communities. And those needs would change depending on where the communities are. And if getting people into those clinics, if getting the help into the clinics is a problem, you need to pay the healthcare providers more. So there's a lot of things that are incredibly complex. But it really comes down to, at the end of the day, a very simple and totally messed up valuation system. We can see the results of how we express value in this country because of these maps. The maps are telling us something. They're telling us about us. Going back to what Perry was saying, the Mercator map that had Europe way oversized, that told the map, every map is a lie and a truth at the same time. And so these maps, I'm going on and on, but this is, the question just invites a large, reflection. So I thank you for that. But the map is not the thing. It's the value system underneath of that. That's, hell, I don't think we're going to change, the 3 or 4 things I mentioned. I'd be happy if we changed one, because then that would start the process of a virtuous circle beginning to take root.
And I think, Jonathan, the issue of value system and the value of political leaders to honor families and histories, and especially in urban centers, is something that I've been thinking about. Mayor Baraka the other day made a statement about not allowing real estate developers to come into Newark, my hometown here, to continue to create this space where people, families, generations of families would be no longer be able to afford to live because they've been kicked out of their home. What happened in my other hometown, New York City, where all of a sudden this interesting city of New York became not so interesting after all of the investments were put in and people of color and poor people were pushed out. So I put that link actually in there, the story about the mayor and his efforts here, which I really, really appreciate. I'm looking outside my window right now from my place, and they're building a 15-story building that I know is going to be full of people who are upper middle class, who are going to afford this rent and who are going to change this neighborhood. And one of the beauties of this neighborhood is that it is the way it is right now. And so I honor the mayor's efforts. I have another question for you, President Holloway. This is from Robert Like. How do we address what might be called the cartography of racism, cultural ignorance, and doubt?
What's the last, say that last bit again?
The cartography of racism, cultural ignorance, and doubt. And Robert is saying, especially the work of Stanford political scientist Robert Proctor on this matter. Robert indicates.
Okay, well, I'll check it out. The cartography of racism, I mean, that's essentially what I'm talking about today, is the cartography of racism. And and that can be expressed in lots of different ways. I think the most important thing and this is again, the work in process element. This is Jonathan spitballing. I've not gone into the literature. I know the literature is there. I think it's The Color of Law. That's the Rothstein title that was evading me, just popped into my head. Amazing book. But I go back to the core principle is maps are telling us something, just not the thing we think they're telling us, if that makes sense. Is you need to take the object and look a layer deeper. And then you start to say, oh, that's what's really going on. I mean, maps are a snapshot in time that have literal descriptions, but that are driven by value propositions. And you can't separate the two of those things. I mean, people think you can, especially in the world of AI and smartphones. I mean, I wasn't explicit about it, but as we are mapping things ourselves, we are mapping what we value when we take photographs and they get geolocated, right? And most of it has no consequence. I mean, it's just, hey, this is where Jonathan was and took photographs. There's nothing more to say about it. But then you start to dig a little bit deeper, and then you say, wait a second, what is it that he values looking at the photographs? And if you look at me, it's photographs. What I value are my dogs, my cats, and flowers in the spring, or meals I ate, right? Pretty mundane stuff. But if you look at that, you can talk about, well, who has the freedom to eat those kinds of meals? You can see just layers of stuff, right? And I'm as much a part of the process as we are all part of this. So the cartography of racism, I'm assuming that's the title of the book. If not, it should be. It's a brilliant title. But it really does speak to this larger phenomenon of what I've been trying to talk about. When I imagine this fuller chapter written as an essay, not as a talk, like I want to go back to, and I don't know where it starts. I know when I started finding out about, I think it's GIS mapping. I mean, this really fascinating data accumulation and then turning it into maps that tell different stories. And, in a sense that they are free from value. No, they are not. They are not. They are telling us all kinds of things, and sort of, what we can pull from these maps are the things that we want to know about. I mean, the data is just like what we're chasing. Like, what's the question I'm trying to answer with this data that will generate something? The question we're asking is the thing that has to be asked. I mean, we need to ask questions of the questions that we're asking, if that makes sense. I mean, that anyway, when I heard that last bit about doubt, for me, that's what set me off down this path, because I think you have to have a grain of doubt or critique or cynicism or nuance or interpretation ready to go in all of these fact-based products that we call maps.
I mean, the GIS work, Jonathan, is like really fascinating, something that I've done and several of my colleagues have done here at the School of Public Health. And I come back always to the thing I know, which is HIV. But, you see HIV rates in this country primarily affecting young Black men, right? Like incidence is highest on young Black men. And so the easy answer, the lazy answer is like, well, they're more risk taking, they just have more risk. And in fact, we've shown in our research center time after time that that's not the case. In fact, young Black men have less sexual risk taking than young white men. But here's what's different. This is what we found in our GIS study, that these young men do not navigate outside their neighborhoods where the viremic pool, where the amount of virus circulating is super high. And having the likelihood of having a partner who's also positive is much greater than from the white guys who are in a lower viremic pool. And these maps tell us, therefore, where public health should be putting its money. Like here, you need to go to the neighborhood and stop expecting these young Black men to come into Chelsea or Greenwich Village or anything to get their services. So the GI stuff is phenomenal. It's amazing to see. And it's often an indication of where people socially navigate of their economic place in our society, right? You can't go someplace if you can't afford to go someplace. All right, I'm stopping now. I'm going to another question. This is from Sebastian Acevedo. And Sebastian says, Dr. Holloway, what advice do you have for trainees within the field of medicine and public health in navigating politically charged environments in which best practices for patients and populations can directly contradict local elected officials or the very people we are sworn to serve? Thank you for that, Sebastian.
Yeah, that's $1 million question. I immediately think of I don't know what the architecture of this looks like in New Jersey, but thinking different parts of the country where how you deliver care for patients who don't speak English or who have dark skin, or within the medical profession, the notion of who can tolerate pain. I mean, that's something you hear, I hear about as just a layperson, has profound effects on the health consequences for individuals. In fact, I know it's a New Jersey thing. That's a whole long story, but I remember helping redirect someone because of the privileges I have to a different medical provider because they were being told that they really couldn't be experiencing this pain. And this was a language issue. I'm sure it was, they had a strong accent. I'm sure this is what was going on. So, I mean, look, as I referenced in the talk, and as I've said to, I don't know how many emails to people who've been upset with me, I'm leaning on the science and the data. Now, I'm fully aware science changes over time. Data shifts, so on and so forth. I know that. In fact, my talk is based on that partly. But we do the best we can with the best practice we know right now. And those should be free of political decisions. A body is a body, after all. And so there are going to be times, and this will become easier the further one gets, the more seniority one gets, it becomes easier to declare that you're going to do this for the sake of the patient. But I always think I believe that you should be able to speak truth to power in those kinds of instances. And you have to figure out, and this is the unfair part, but that we're in America, it's unfair. You have to figure out how much risk you're willing to take personally so you can continue providing care in the medium term, the long term. You have to figure out your risk tolerance in the short term. In a non-healthcare related circumstance, as a historian speaking, there were times as a Black professor, certainly being available and wanting to be available for Black students in need. And this is not a new story with me. This is an old story, and many of you have experienced this from different perspectives. I'm just talking about Black. And at some point, I had to make a decision. Like, I love these kids. I want to be there for them. But if I don't get this book published, I will not be there for them. Mm-hmm. And so for the next year or two, like mainly getting up to tenure, I had to make some short-term decisions that didn't feel very good, but that would enable me to be around for the long term. I'm not trying to oversimplify. You are talking about day-to-day life and death choices, perhaps. I'm talking about getting a book published. It's different. I recognize that. But I do think one has to think in short, medium, and long-term ways. And the trick is, as I told myself and I've told others since then, the compromises what I felt were compromises that I made at a particular moment in my career, I had to make those things and then not get comfortable in what I will call the compromise space. That I had to get back to the things that I really valued the most now that I had the protection to keep on doing it. Getting back to what you value the most is for some the tricky thing, because, you know, it was easy to have more time to myself to focus on my own scholarship and to say no to these requests to come speak here, come speak there, and do other things. It was easier to live my life with my head down and my blinders on. You're gonna have to make a decision if you do make those sort of compromising choices, not putting people at risk, but, you know, thinking of how much you're gonna push back against somebody, that when you get to the other side of that equation, that you do not simply stay in that same mode. You gotta remember your roots. It's the best advice I can give. There's nothing easy about it, I'm afraid.
Thank you for that. You know, I just want to echo something that Pamela Puglia has said here, which I think is, you know, thematic of the things we're talking about today. It's like, she says, as healthcare providers, as a start and at a minimum, we must recognize how social, cultural context and biological embedding impact health as a result of structural racism. And I think the notion that we have it's George Engel told us in 1977, biopsychosocial. Yes, we didn't believe him. We still believe that we would put a vaccine out there and it would be all solved, except we forgot that we're dealing with human beings, right?
Yeah.
Complex organisms. And so thank you, Pamela, for that comment.
There was, just very quickly, there was a
Yeah.
whole school of economic theory about rational economic behavior. And this is all the rage. I'm like, but humans are fundamentally irrational. Like this will, I mean, you could do neat things with, I mean, for a long time, economists were like, they were mathematicians during the height of this rage. I'm like, okay, you can prove it in a laboratory setting, but you do know people are irrational. So
Right.
this is not going to hold together.
I mean, I can't tell you, Jonathan, the amount of times I said that on the press over the last 2 years, that these social cognitive models, that people's self-efficacy is enough to direct their health behavior, is just simply wrong, right? And that people want to feel good, people want to be happy, that's what's going to drive them ultimately. So Kelly Penna says, I am a speech and language pathologist, and I find that within healthcare, language, dialect, and accent have significant impact on access to education. How has this impacted the research you've discussed today in terms of access?
I was with you all until the last bit. I mean, in terms of how, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but in terms of how I do my work, I mean, I'm a historian. I find sources and I just consume it and best I can in the time that I have. So it doesn't really affect my work. Well, I mean, if the question is wondering about almost the psychosocial elements of it, it's depressing as hell. I mean, I don't, the books, well, you're in my other offices, you'd see my books in lining my office. None of them are happy books. I mean, I don't work in an area of, hey, look at a great thing that just happened. And usually the era is like, look at something that was stolen or taken or deprived of people. So I guess I live in that space conceptually. And this is also why I think it's really important, as part of my talk about a beloved community, is making sure that we are recognizing everybody who helps the university function. Because if we don't look at those who are invisible, if we don't look for those people who do that labor, cleaning up the bedpans, picking up the garbage, cutting the lawns, if they go away, we'll know about it within a day's time, because we won't be able to do our work, that is the stuff that has the most value. And so this is why it's so important, because I understand by having read histories and written histories of denial and trauma, the importance of recognizing the role that everybody has a constructive and positive role to play in a system. And if not, there's something wrong with the system itself. If that is not recognized, there's something wrong with the system itself.
Right, there's no doubt that healthcare providers place themselves at risk and were vulnerable to this pandemic. But you know who was more vulnerable? The people in the supermarket, the Amazon drivers, those folks who kept our lives going, who
Yes.
go unrecognized, who had no choice but to leave their home. And, you know, we have to continue to elevate that and bring it up and say, they are equal heroes to the vaccine developers, because our lives would have stopped otherwise.
That's right. You know, I just saw in a chat that, you know, here I was having fun with my browser and I forgot to share my browser. Did you see any of that stuff I was talking about?
Some of it.
Okay. Because I can show you a couple of things right now if you take 45 seconds.
If you, yes, we have some time. Go ahead.
So I want to show, here we go. So you can see this map now, right? Finally. Okay. And this is the animation that I kept talking about from 1980 to 2014. I'll play it a few times. It gets lighter, of course, but you see the darkest area, deaths per 100,000 people still in the Mississippi, up the river valley, and it is slightly darker along the eastern seaboard of the US, and also in areas of indigenous populations and Latinx populations. So this is just the story of, it's a story of death, but it's a story of where people live and certain people. And on this website, you can go to, you can see all these different things you can track. And it's just, you basically get the same story over and over again. This is what I wanted to share. And I also had, mapping inequality. This is the website where I started. And I was clicking on, I think, and you can click on the different districts and the image pops up. So I clicked on this one, and it's Union County, New Jersey, this district, 23rd district. A scan shows, this is a version of what I was reading from, and show map. And then I was reading here, this area here, that is about the infiltration of Italian and Negroes in these areas and what that means as far as the degradation of value for this particular tract in Union County. So this is the mapping inequality website. The link was in the talk, but this is just an example of how quite elegant the map is, and what it tells is actually quite horrific at the same time. So now I feel better. You got some of the stuff I thought I was showing you. Now you see it.
Thank you for that. I want to also just make a comment to somebody who's is anonymous here, but to just say the issue of history in public health research and practice is a really important thing, right? And so, in fact, we are. I believe this is probably one of our students. The leaders of our school are gathering at the end of the month to take a hard look at our curriculum and talk about how do we embed history more effectively into the curriculum, because humanities and public health and science and medicine go together, and that's what our students want, and we have to make sure it's evident in how we teach our students. So stay tuned for that. It's a work in progress. We have 1 minute left, and in that 1 minute, I want to say, President Holloway, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This has been absolutely incredible. You are welcome to come join us anytime you want. We look forward to further conversations. We are here to help you in any way you need. Thank you for all you do for us, for our university, for our state. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's not an enjoyable topic, but I enjoyed sharing my thoughts on it, and the questions clearly were generating more thoughts for me. So thank you so much.
Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone. If you're in my biostats class, your exam drops today at 5:45. Don't forget to go online and get it. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.